One of my recent goals as a retro game collector has been to replace all of my original wired controllers for my retro systems with good quality third-party wireless options. If you've been following this channel for a while, you know I've already replaced my N64 controllers, so now I am focusing on the Super Nintendo. The two controllers I'm going to be looking at are the SN30 Pro and the Retrobit Legacy 16. These two controllers are very similar in terms of functionality, but does the price difference reflect its quality? Let's find out.
Okay.
All right, so first we're going to look at the cheaper of the two controllers, and that's the Retrobit Legacy 16. Out of the box, you get the controller itself, a USB-A to USB-C cable, some documentation, a USB receiver that works for PC, Mac, Android, and Switch, and an SNES receiver, which was my main reasoning for purchasing this controller. To use the controller with the Super Nintendo, simply plug in the receiver to the controller port of the Super Nintendo and turn the console on. With the console powered on, press the sync button on the receiver and press start on the controller and wait for them to sync. Overall, I'd say the Retrobit Legacy 16 feels fine in the hands, if not a little bit cheap. This is mostly due to the cheap plastic used for the housing, but to me the face buttons, start, select, and shoulder buttons all feel good, and I do like that you can use either set of shoulder buttons for L and R functionality. Now, when talking about replacing a Super Nintendo controller, probably one of the most important features on a controller is its D-pad. And I gotta say, aside from it feeling just a tad stiff, I've had a great experience using it with games like Super Mario World and Donkey Kong Country. The thumbsticks, while more intended for use with the Nintendo Switch, actually are nice to use with certain games like Mario Kart or NBA Jam. With that being said, I do worry about the longevity of these sticks, as they are clearly the same sticks used with the Nintendo Switch Joy-Con controllers. If I do start experiencing drifting issues with this controller, I'll try to remember and leave a pinned comment down below. As far as battery life is concerned, they advertise about 10 hours of battery life with the Retrobit Legacy 16. I've been playing a lot of NBA Jam with my son over the last week, totaling about 8 to 9 hours, and I haven't had any issues with the controller dying on me, so yeah, I believe the marketing material with that. Now, I was just going to make this review initially on the Retrobit Legacy 16, but I have had the SN30 Pro for some time and recently realized that you can actually pick up a SNES receiver from 8BitDo and use this as a Super Nintendo controller. So I went ahead and picked one up. The sync process is pretty similar to that of the Retrobit's controller. You just power the console on, hit the sync button on the SNES receiver, and then on the SN30 Pro, just hit the start button to turn the controller on, and then hit the sync button to finish syncing with the receiver. Just like the Retrobit controller, the lights will turn solid once it's paired. In comparison to the Retrobit controller, the SN30 Pro feels much higher in build quality, and the overall ergonomics and housing feel much more similar to the original SNES controller. With that being said, the SN30 Pro plus the additional receiver cost almost twice as much as that of the Retrobit Legacy 16. So does that high quality really match that difference in price? I will say that overall the controller feels and plays great, and the thumbsticks are a much bigger improvement over the Legacy 16. They're much more akin to that of a DualShock 4 controller. They feel a lot nicer to use, and I am not worried about these drifting anytime soon. The shoulder buttons feel comfortable and higher quality than the Legacy 16, but the D-pad, like the Retrobit controller, is a little bit on the stiff side, if not a little bit more. The D-pad's interesting because I actually like the texture of this D-pad a bit more, but it is a bit more tactile feeling. You just feel a more prominent bump with each directional press. I'm not necessarily saying it's worse, but the SNES controller and the Retrobit definitely feel a little more on the mushy side when compared to the SN30 Pro. If I am to nitpick a little bit, I will say where I don't like the more tactile feel is in the buttons. In comparison to both the original Super Nintendo controller and the Legacy 16, the face buttons on the SN30 Pro are much more clicky, which again is a nitpick on my part. A lot of people might actually prefer that, but as far as trying to replicate the experience of the original SNES controller, I would have liked to seen these buttons be a little bit more on the mushy side. If you're concerned about latency when using these with your Super Nintendo, I don't think you're going to have any noticeable delay. Both of the receivers for the controllers use a 2.4 gigahertz connection, so they are very responsive, and unless the battery is running low, you shouldn't notice any issues. Now again, this review is more focused on using these controllers with a Super Nintendo, but you can use them with a Nintendo Switch if you'd like. The Retrobit requires you to use the USB receiver, so you're only going to be able to use this when the Switch is in dock mode. Just like with the Super Nintendo receiver, hit the sync button on the receiver and hit start on the controller. You're also going to need to make sure that the Pro wired communication is turned on in your Switch's settings. Just like with the SNES receiver, the latency is really good as it utilizes the 2.4 gigahertz connection, and both modern and retro games on the Switch was an enjoyable experience. The only downside with this controller when using it with the Switch is that this has no motion control capability, so any games that require motion controls will not work with this controller. The Switch is where I think the SN30 Pro really shines over the Retrobit Legacy 16. You can connect it to the Switch over Bluetooth just like you would with any normal Pro controller, and unlike Retrobit's controller, this actually has gyro capability. So playing games like Breath of the Wild or Splatoon work just fine with this. As far as which one of these controllers would I recommend, well, it kind of depends. If you're just looking at getting a wireless controller for your Super Nintendo, I would say that the Retrobit Legacy 16 is actually a wonderful option and is actually my preferred of the two for the Super Nintendo, just because the D-pad and the face buttons are a little closer to that of the original Super Nintendo controller. But with that being said, where the Retrobit's D-pad and face buttons feel more similar to the Super Nintendo's controller, the overall shell and shape of the SN30 Pro feels much more similar to the original controller than the Retrobit does. So it kind of depends on what you're looking for out of a controller. Like I said before, the SN30 Pro's D-pad and face buttons are a little bit more on the tactile side, and some people actually do prefer that. So, you know, it's all kind of goes down to personal preference. If you're looking to save some money and you want to replicate the D-pad and face button experience of the Super Nintendo, I'd go with the Retrobit. Otherwise, if you have the money to spend and you have a Nintendo Switch where you want an additional controller with it, I'd say the SN30 Pro plus the receiver is definitely a great buy. I say if you prefer to play games on the Nintendo Switch, pick up the SN30 Pro, and if you want to use this as a wireless controller down the line for your Super Nintendo, well, then just pick up the wireless dongle that 8BitDo sells separately. Whichever of these controllers you decide to get for yourself, I will leave the appropriate Amazon affiliate links down in the description below so you can check it out for yourself. As always, thanks so much for watching the video and checking out the channel. If you like this type of content, let us know by hitting that like or dislike button, and leave a comment down below if you have any questions or want to share any of your experiences with either of these two controllers. Feel free to hit us up on any of our social media platforms and consider joining our Discord community server, all listed in the description down below. With that being said, thank you so much again for watching. My name is Blake, and for all things tech, games, movies, to anything nerdy in between, be sure to subscribe to Digital Cynics. Have a good one, everyone. We'll see you next time.